font seems to be not quite working. My experience is that it works on later slides, so we'll see. You don't really need to see that I'm Kathleen Fisher, and I'm a professor at Tufts, and I was the program manager at DARPA who started the HACMS program. That's what the letters in blue say. The letters in red says, using formal methods to eliminate exploitable bugs. As I'm talking, please feel free to interrupt and ask questions. We're a relatively small group, and it's easier if or it's more fun to be interactive. Okay, so I want to start with the observation that you're probably not surprised by, that network computers are unacceptably insecure at this point. So I'd like to start by looking at this picture, which, how many people have seen this picture? One person. Okay, so I can tell you about this picture. So this is a white Jeep Cherokee. It is in a ditch beside the road outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And it was being driven by Andy Greenberg, who was a reporter for Wired magazine, when he drove into the ditch. So the scenario here is that two white hat hackers, Charlie Miller and Chris Valachek, talked the reporter into getting into the Jeep, where he pretty much knew that they were going to take it over while he was running the car, but I don't think he fully expected what he got in exchange for getting in the car. So he got in the car and he drove away. So Chris and Charlie were at one of their houses with their laptop. And as he was on the highway, so he was on Route 66 going highway speeds, the air conditioner started blaring full speed. So he tried to push the dashboard, nothing happened. After the air conditioner started, then the radio came on and started playing a rap song by Skee-Lo. Again, pushing the dashboard, nothing happened. Then the windshield wipers came on and the spray came up so that he couldn't really see out the windshield wiper. And then he started going up the big overpass and they cut the transmission to his car. So his foot was still on the accelerator and the RPMs were going up, but the car wasn't accelerating. In fact, it was getting slower and slower. And as he was going up the accelerator, up the on-ramp, his speed was slowing down. He looked in the rearview mirror and there was a semi behind him. Thankfully, he was able to not have an accident. No one was actually hurt, although that was it was quite irresponsible as a test goes. What Charlie and Chris were able to do was they were able to wirelessly hack in through the telematics unit of the car and take over control of the software running the car and give it instructions that overrode the instructions that Andy was giving as the driver of the car. This is possible because a modern automobile is really a bunch of computers, somewhere between 30 and 100 embedded control units connected via a bunch of networks. And there are about 5 different network connections from those networks to outside the car networks. So there's, for example, the telematics unit. That's the thing that will call 911 if you have an accident, will unlock your car if you lock your keys in the car. That means your car actually has a cell phone number. And that's the way that Chris and Charlie communicated with the car while Andy was on the highway using the cell phone number. There's also a Bluetooth interface that's really handy so that you can connect your phone to the car. There's a tire pressure monitor, there's the entertainment system, and there's the diagnostic port that a mechanic can plug into to do upgrades. So none of the results here were particularly surprising. Researchers a few years earlier at UCSD and University of Washington, so Stefan Savage and Yoshi Kono, had showed very similar things on a different car. They were much more responsible about how they reported it. They didn't get a reporter to get in the car on the highway. They instead had a researcher in a crash helmet who signed a death release on a closed track Boeing runway. And they were very careful not to reveal who the manufacturer of the car was, because their sense was that this problem was endemic to the car industry. It was not specific to any particular car. Their more responsible behavior caused a car manufacturer to invest some more in security. This one caused Jeep to have to recall something like 1.5 million cars and invest a lot more money in the security of their system.
Kathy?
Yes?
Why did it end up in the ditch, though?
Yeah, so the ditch, that was they had him parked just on the side, so the picture is kind of fake.
Ah! Okay.
Yeah.
So he wasn't run off by the semi?
He wasn't run off by the semi, he just pulled off, yeah.
Yes,
So,
okay.
yeah, it was like rereading the article for, I don't know, the 10th time or something, and like, wait, that picture, that doesn't actually correspond to the narrative, so good catch there. Right.
Fake news.
Yeah, fake news, right. So this is just one example.
We have to be vigilant, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, it's quite the day for that too, right?
Yeah, sorry.
No worries. I think in this case the spirit is true, even if the picture is a little bit misleading. And this is just cars, right? There are many other systems like this that are vulnerable to attack. And like medical devices are another canonical example. Pacemakers and insulin pumps. White hat hackers have shown for both classes of devices that it's possible to hack in wirelessly, take over control, and cause behavior that would not be good for the patient in those cases. Okay, so why is this so insecure? Like clearly Chrysler doesn't actually want their Jeep to be that insecure, and medical providers don't want their pacemakers and insulin pumps to be that insecure. Why is it so insecure? Fundamentally, it's a really hard problem. To get a system to have good security, you have to get many, many things right all at the same time. So many things right that like even an octopus doesn't have enough arms to take care of everything at the same time. Just to explain why there's an octopus on the slide. So, for example, you have to get the design right. If you have a design that's flawed, game over. You're not going to be able to have good security. You need to be able to specify what you want in a good way, in a clear way. If you can't write down your designs clearly, then game over. You have to be able to implement your design correctly. If you have bugs in your implementation, then a hacker is going to be able to break in most likely. There's all sorts of possibilities for side channel leaks. Even if you get everything right, you can misconfigure it when you go ahead and install it in the field, and you can leave some gaping hole open that will allow an attacker to break in. You have users, right? Users are terrible when it comes to security, right? Think about your own password usage or my own password usage. It's really, really painful to have passwords that are hard to guess and that change frequently enough. It's also, password users are easily faked out, particularly with using AI to craft spear phishing messages that have personalized information that were scraped from your Facebook page. It can be very, very difficult to not fall for a convincing fake. Passwords are usually too weak. You have insiders who are not on your side. Physical security, right? If an adversary can access your computer physically, often they can monkey with the memory and make it do whatever they want. All of this is built on top of third-party software, so not only do you have to get all of this right, but so does everybody else who you use their software have to get everything right. The hardware has mistakes in it. The hardware has places where the abstraction that the hardware provides doesn't match the abstraction that they told you they provided, which can be exploited, for example, with Rowhammer and Spectre and Meltdown, and so on. So it's a really, really hard problem. For this talk, I'm just going to focus on one specific area, which is this one, implementation errors. And I'm going to say that actually there's things we can do to make it so implementation errors are much less likely to be there and therefore much less likely to be exploitable. So given that that's just one of the many security areas, why should we care so much about it? So it turns out there are really many exploitable vulnerabilities in software. So this is a chart that is I took from the VulnerableDB mid-year quick view report. So basically this company collects vulnerability reports and publishes statistics about them. So in 2018, they published there were 10,599 vulnerabilities reported in the first 6 months of 2018, so this year. And of those, roughly half, these categories, had known exploits. So that shows that many bugs, times people make mistakes, actually can be exploited. So a vulnerability is just a bug in the code. An exploit is code that can take advantage of that vulnerability to make the software do something that the original owner didn't intend, or to exfiltrate information. So non-trivial number of bugs lead to exploits. These exploits can do bad things, right? So this is just an example of the Microsoft Security Bulletin MS-1578, which was critical. It was released in July 20, 2015. It was talking about a bug that allowed remote code execution on every single supported Windows platform at the time. It was caused by an buffer underflow error in an Adobe Type Manager library. So this is a software flaw that led to remote code execution on every platform Microsoft supported, clearly not something that Microsoft actually wanted. Similarly, Heartbleed was a missing bounds check in an open SSL library that allowed stealing secret information in a way that left no log. So you couldn't tell afterwards whether somebody had stolen information using Heartbleed or not. So this shows that these vulnerabilities can cause damage. It can cause crashes, and it can cause exfiltration of useful information. Probably didn't doubt either of those things. Converting a bug into an exploit is actually really, really hard. There are not very many people on the planet who can do it. The fact that, some of the things those people come up with are unbelievably clever. I wish that mental energy was devoted to a different purpose. But there are not that many people. However, those people, some of them have an entrepreneurial streak. So in addition to finding the vulnerabilities, they can then package them up into exploit toolkits that are available for purchase on the dark web. So for example, the Phoenix exploit kit, which was available in 2010, combined a whole bunch of different exploits, most of which had to do with bugs in the code that would allow any random person who just knew enough to be able to go buy the exploit kit to use it to steal information or exfiltrate information. So this is allowing sort of people at scale to use exploits to steal information or exfiltrate, to crash things. Right, so we have a pretty big problem, basically, is what these slides are saying with respect to security and particularly implementation bugs. So the hypothesis for the rest of this talk is that this thing called formal methods can help eliminate many of these exploitable vulnerabilities. So if you've been around for a while, you might hear that hypothesis and you say like, yeah, I've been there, I tried that, I wasn't impressed, it didn't work, basically stop wasting my time, I'm looking for a real solution. So I would argue that now is actually a really good time to revisit this hypothesis about whether formal methods can be useful for this kind of a problem or not. And the formal methods community has really been claiming this for 50 years. And I would say that now is actually about the time where they can start to make good on that promise. So why is that? The first has really nothing to do with formal methods research at all, except it has to do with Moore's law. So this graph is just showing the horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis is orders of magnitude, green is number of transistors, dark, this color is clock speed, power, and performance per clock cycle. So this is actually kind of showing the end of Moore's law. But the point is really this exponential increase in the number of transistors and the clock speed. Fundamentally, lots of formal methods boil down to a really, really big search problem. And it turns out really big search problems work much better on computers that have a lot of memory and run really fast. So the fact that computers that architects have done so much for us really, really helps formal methods be able to be applied to software at scale. A second thing is that researchers in formal methods have improved basic techniques that allow us to help with the automation of formal methods. So how many people know what a SAT solver is? Please raise your hand if you know what a SAT solver is. Okay, cool, all of you guys know. So I can just summarize quickly. So a SAT solver takes a Boolean formula over true and false and connected via and or nots, finds an assignment of truth values to those variables that makes the whole formula true, exponentially an NP-complete problem in general. Turns out you can use heuristics to solve the problem much, much faster in many cases. There's a cottage industry coming up with SAT solvers that are much faster. They compete with each other. There's an annual competition. What this graph shows is Daniel Lebert took the winning SAT solver from 2002 to 2010 and ported them all to the problem instances from 2009, and he ran them all on a computer circa 2010. And so each one of these lines represents one SAT solver. The horizontal axis is how many problems are solved. The vertical axis is how much time it takes. So a line that goes low is solving more problems in a shorter period of time. So you can see how much difference it's made. It's like, just take this point of 80 problems. How long did it take a solver to solve 80 problems? So the best solver in 2002 took 1,000 seconds, so up here, to solve 80 problems. Whereas the best solver in 2010 took 40 seconds. So that's almost 2 orders of magnitude improvement on top of the improvement that the architects have already given us. So that's a huge, more of the search space we can search automatically for solutions. A third reason is the increased infrastructure that's available. So when formal methods researchers in the past were claiming that they could prove properties about real software, the same researchers that were developing the formal methods tools were simultaneously trying to apply them to solve real-world problems. It turns out that both of those are full-time jobs, and so it was hard to be successful at both. But now there are many, many tools in the formal methods toolchain that are just available, and they're not maybe commercial quality software that would be shrink-wrapped and sold for lots of money, but they're a good enough quality that researchers or people who are not the original tool makers can use them. There are tutorials, there are classes, there are textbooks, so that a substantial population beyond the original creators are now able to use these tools successfully. So the infrastructure is much, much better. And then the last part, which is down here, I'm sure you can't read it, is another really crucial part, which is the problem size and complexity has gotten to the point where industrial developers on certain areas know that the problems are sufficiently complicated that they can't solve them without help. So this quote comes from Amazon Web Services. They wrote a white paper in 2000 and 2 digits in a font I can't read, It was like 2014-ish. It says we have found that testing the code is inadequate as a method to find subtle errors in design, as the number of reachable states in the code is astronomical, so we looked for a better approach. Basically, at Amazon Web Services, a once-in-a-million event happens like within a second. Every second, there's a once-in-a-million event. So human intuition is really good about common things, but once in a million is not, we're not good at that. Formal methods tools are really good at driving everything into corner cases so that you make sure that you understand what happens in the 1 in a million, or 1 in 10 million, or 1 in 100 million cases, which come up all the time in systems at scale today. Questions about any of that so far? Okay, so some evidence. DARPA's HACMS program, where we used formal methods to produce more secure vehicles. So the setup here was we wanted to explore this hypothesis that formal methods were ready for prime time to be able to produce vehicles that would be much more hardened against cyber attacks. So the threat model here was the attacker, the red team, could not physically touch the vehicles that we were interested in. They could only attack remotely. It's not that we don't care about attacks that are based on physical proximity, but attacks that you can do wirelessly over like a cell phone network or things that you can do at scale and you can do it remotely. So the chance for impact is much higher. So that's the threat model we adopted for this program. We assume that hardware is correct. We know full well that that's not a good assumption, but you have to only bite so much off of the apple at a time. So we assumed for the purpose of the program that hardware is correct. And then we had a couple of different experimental platforms. We had an quad-copter, which you can buy from off the shelf from Amazon. It had roughly 100,000 lines of code. That code was all open source and was all available to all of the performers on the program, no problem. And then we had a paired vehicle, which is Boeing's unmanned Little Bird. This is a helicopter that's big enough to have 2 pilots, but it also can fly fully autonomously. This platform is ITAR restricted. It has all sorts of corporate IP associated with it. So really only the Boeing engineers were able to see the software on this platform. And the goal of the program was to produce, by the end of the 4.5 years, versions of both of these that a red team would not be able to hack into and take over control. And as a baseline, we had a red team attack the system at the very beginning of the program. So there's a video here that I'm not going to play because it doesn't exit very well. But the video is showing the blue team researchers. These are not the experts in penetration testing. These are the formal methods researchers. They downloaded a tool called air cracking. And that tool just basically let them connect to the quadcopter while it was in the air, disconnect the quadcopter from the legitimate ground control station that was controlling the copter, and then doing the equivalent of flying it off into the sunset. Basically showing it's ridiculously easy to hack into a quadcopter. That's not really surprising because the quadcopters are designed to be connected to. I think the threat model that the quadcopter manufacturers is worried about is the quadcopter being in a park and having no one be able to connect to it, and so kind of be rogue, as opposed to the neighbor boy stealing your quadcopter by hacking into it, or the neighbor girl stealing it. So it wasn't tremendously surprising that the quadcopter was broken into easily. The Boeing helicopter was also broken into easily. The red team was able to take over, do the equivalent that they would have been able to fly the Boeing helicopter off into the sunset. That surprised the Boeing engineers a lot. So that's the baseline, the very beginning of the program. During the first 16 months then, the researchers worked on re-architecting and redoing as much of the software as they could in the quadcopter. So they started with the monolithic, so this is kind of time going this way. This is a sort of notional diagram of the architecture of the copter through various times. These are the different people, teams who were working on things and the various contributions they were making. It started with the monolithic software. There was no real-time operating system. There was no security. This is the one that the red team broke into. They re-architected it. They changed the underlying chip so it was slightly more powerful. They added a hardware abstraction layer so that the code above didn't know if it was running on this platform or this platform. They made this open source and gave it back to their community. Actually won an award for the biggest contribution to this particular quadcopter software stack that year. Then they started replacing the pieces with high assurance code. So they replaced the FreeRTOS with the eCronos system that was built out of Data61 in Australia. They started writing the code for the flight control of the things that keep the helicopter in the air, using a domain-specific language embedded in Haskell that would generate the C code along with proof conditions that the C code didn't have integer overflow or underflow, things like that. By the end of the first phase, they also were generating the glue code from a high-level architecture description language that made sure that they could get all the pieces together properly.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Is that SEL4 under?
No, it's not. So SEL4 will come into the story, but not quite yet.
Oh, so what is the verified
Free.
OS?
It's called eChronos. It's an RTOS that they have also developed. Same
They mean.
Data 61. The same people that
Okay.
developed SEL4
It
also
is the
developed
same.
an RTOS.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, same people, but a different software artifact.
Okay.
Smaller.
Got it.
Yeah, and focused on real time. Okay, so the blue team basically had 16 months to put together a new version of the quadcopter that used their various formal methods-based techniques. So some of it was proving things in a theorem prover, some of it was generating code in a domain-specific language, some of it was generating code, some of it was just proving properties about that generated code. In terms of functionality, they were able to replicate the stability control, the altitude hold, the directional hold, and the added DOS detection. So basically, they replicated all of the basic functionality of the quadcopter. They only got about 80% of the GPS waypoint navigation done before they ran out of time. So it's not quite as functional as the original Amazon version of the quadcopter. And they proved a bunch of system-wide properties. They proved that the system was memory safe. They proved that if a malformed message came from the ground station, it would just be ignored. They proved that if a message was not properly signed and authenticated, so it didn't necessarily come from the legitimate ground control station, it would also be ignored. And they proved that all good messages that were received by the copter radio would be acted upon. So they couldn't prove that they would get all of the messages that the ground station sent, because jamming is a very real possibility. But they did prove that if the quadcopter got the message, it would act on that message. The red team then had full access to the system. They knew everything about it. They had all of the code. They had all the design documentations. They were able to sit in on all of the messages with design meetings with the blue team. So they knew as much about the quadcopter as you could expect a red team to be able to know. And they had 6 weeks with it. At the end of that time, they reported that they could find no flaws that would allow them to exploit the functionality of the quadcopter. So they could no longer break in and take over control after 16 months of work from the blue team. My colleague, who was a penetration testing expert at DARPA at the time, his assessment was that that UAV at the time was the most secure UAV on the planet, which is a little scary if you think about what UAVs are doing on the planet. So that was just after the first 16 months of the program, right? The program is actually 4.5 years long. So my boss at I2O at the time basically called me over and said, like, wow, like this result, program is already a total success. And they thought when they gave me the $70 million for HACMS that it was going to be a total failure. So I was like, wow, 16 months, they already reached success in DARPA's eyes. But we weren't done. We said, why stop now? We can keep doing more. So they kept working. So the Boeing engineers got with the people who worked on the quadcopter, and they took the results from the quadcopter and moved them over to the Boeing helicopter. So the Boeing helicopter is a little more complicated. There are 2 computers instead of 1. There's the flight control computer, which controls the same kinds of things as on the quadcopter, the altitude hold, the stability, the things that keeps it flying as a helicopter. And then there's a mission control computer that communicates with the ground station and that tells the helicopter where to fly and when to take pictures, and basically is the brains of the operation. So they re-architected it so that the mission control computer ran SEL4, so that's running the verified microkernel at the bottom level. They had multiple partitions, and one of those partitions, they had the code that communicates with the ground station, and that code was verified and encrypted, and so could be, with high assurance, you knew that you were talking to the legitimate ground station. They also rewrote and verified the code to talk to the flight control computer, which was also considered to be high assurance. But the partition that had the camera, that was modeling legacy code or third-party code that you don't really know what's going on and you're unsure about that. So during phase 3, they let the red team put whatever code they wanted in the camera partition, and they gave the red team root privilege in that partition. So in this case, they didn't make the red team penetrate into the helicopter from the outside. They gave the red team root access in the low assurance partition that had the camera software. And they challenged the red team, break out of your partition or disrupt the operation of the quadcopter, of the helicopter in any way. And they were so confident in phase 3, they let the red team do that assessment while the helicopter was in the air with 2 safety pilots in place, right? They obviously had done this before on the ground, but the red team had the same knowledge of the system. They knew everything about the system. They had all the design documents. They had all of the code. They had participated in all the design documents. And the red team was not able to break out of the partition or disrupt the operation of the rest of the copter at all. They could fork bomb themselves, which would crash the camera partition. But the rest of the system had a monitor looking at the camera partition saying like, oh wait, camera went down, restart it. So it would come back up again, and the copter within 10 seconds would be back in its normal configuration. So this was obviously very successful. The recent John McCain National Defense Authorization Act, the John McCain National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1657, Part C, Sub 3, actually directs the DoD to study techniques such as those developed by HACMS in order to make more secure systems for the Pentagon. The law actually names HACMS explicitly, so that was kind of cool. Yeah. So very excited. The hope here is that we get a virtuous spiral going on, right? So the point in some sense is that now so in addition to the helicopter, during phase 3, the program manager who took over from me, Ray Richards, went and got like 10 different militarily relevant platforms that applied HACMS technologies to all these different 10, not just this one helicopter, with the goal of building up a big set of test cases or use cases so that procurement officers and the Pentagon could go and write their requests for proposals and say, we expect you to formally verify this part of your system, prove this part of your system is memory safe. Yep, Franz?
So how many people are there in the world who can actually do this, right? I mean,
true, don't, stop. Yes, there are definitely, so like, the next part of the talk is limitations. But I'm trying, like, just let me make the finish argument for setting up the spiral piece here. So on that note, though, like, if you notice, the people who did the work on the unmanned Little Bird were not formal verification engineers. They were Boeing engineers. They were PhD Boeing aviation engineers, but they were not trained in formal methods. They learned what they needed to by sitting with the other engineers looking at the quadcopter example. So there was definitely a built-in transfer, so that at the end of HACMS, there were more researchers who could do this than there were at the beginning of HACMS. And some of them did not go and get PhDs in formal methods. In terms of the spiral, we want to get it so that the procurement officers in the Pentagon, when they write their requests for proposals, will add language that say you have to do this formal verification. We would, like, before HACMS, or even with HACMS potentially, you expect the defense contractors to come back to Washington to say, come on, take that language out. No one can do this, like your argument, right? There's no one on the planet who can do this. If you put this language in, no one will bid on it, you won't get your thing. And so now the procurement officer can respond basically saying, like, these grad students did it. Like, if they can do it, why can't you do it? So the hope is that the procurement officer will have the spine to leave the language in, and then the defense contractors will go and say, okay, let's go hire those grad students or hire their friends, build our, go find these open, what is this Coq thing? Go figure out how to use Coq and the other formal methods tools. Build the capability in-house so that they can now succeed in those responding to those RFPs, and also then develop the capability so that they could then think about using it for other things like pacemakers and insulin pumps. Of course, that's a whole different industry, but if it starts to be known that you can do this kind of thing in industry successfully, then other people will be able to use it. That's the hope. I mean, it's a hope. It could totally fail, but that's part of the idea of HACMS. Okay, so what exactly are formal methods? So I've given this talk to very different audiences. So I've given it to security audiences who know all the stuff I've told you before, and they don't know anything about formal methods. You guys are much more on the formal method side, so I'm going to go faster on the formal methods piece. But if you have questions, please feel free to stop me. So formal methods are kind of an ill-defined term. It's sort of a grab bag or a kitchen sink of techniques that are based on math for proving properties about code or models of code or hardware or models of hardware. It's a little bit like, Justice Stewart, when you see it. I would say basically it's based on math, it's machine checkable, and it's capable of proving properties about code or models. It is really important that you read the fine print. There are assumptions, and if you don't satisfy the assumptions of the theorems don't apply. It could be that your assumptions are unreasonable, and it can be that the guarantees of the theorem are actually too weak to be useful. So it's important to pay attention to the fine print. There's actually a whole range of formal methods-based tools. This is a notional chart where the horizontal axis is how much effort is required, and the vertical axis is how much guarantee do you get. So on this side, it's basically automatic. It requires no effort. Right. And on the right-hand side, it takes PhD years per 1,000 lines of code to prove something. The vertical axis is like level of guarantee. So at the bottom is type safety, right? Your type checker for ML or Haskell or Java or C# or many other languages is in fact a formal method-based technique. It's proving properties about your program. Maybe not very strong properties, but it is proving properties about your program. In the middle is kind of no runtime errors, and at the top is full functional correctness. So there are a bunch of different techniques. So there are type systems, there's symbolic executors, there's model checkers, there's sound static analyzers, verified runtime monitoring, automatic theorem provers, and then interactive theorem provers. And all of these different kinds of techniques have been used to prove various real systems are correct in some way. Up to the top here where we have like SEL4 is the verified microkernel, CompCert is a verifying C compiler. So you get sort of better, more bang for your buck in different places depending on your level of investment. Okay, so that's kind of what formal methods are. If we step back and think certainly not all software is really worth verifying, right? You can probably imagine most software is not worth verifying. But there are certain kinds of software that probably is worth our while to invest in and produce exquisite artifacts that we can then leverage to build larger systems that have the properties we want. You think about the list, the things that might be on that list are things like separation kernel, hypervisor, real-time operating systems, a C compiler, file system, web browser, browser sandbox, crypto algorithms, garbage collectors. And the good news is that we actually have instances of all of these different kinds of systems that have already been proven to be fully functionally correct. So this slide gives the names of these systems and gives the citations for papers where you have the details. So just picking two examples, these are the two examples that when you pitch a program at DARPA, you have to explain to them why there is any hope at all of your program succeeding. What's the basis of confidence? And CompCert and SEL4 were the two examples I gave to DARPA saying there's some prayer that we could actually do this. So SEL4 is a microkernel. It's a general purpose operating system that is the absolute pared down, tiniest essence of what absolutely has to be running in privileged mode. The team at Data 61, which was called NICTA at the time, which is a research lab in Australia, a government research lab, which the government keeps harassing, which just seems bizarre, right? They have this unbelievably fantastic contributions to world security and knowledge, and they keep getting moved around and resized, and it's just phenomenal lack of insight on the part of the Australian government. Okay, my personal opinion aside. Okay, they implemented and proved correct SEL4 microkernel in Isabelle Hall. It's about 10,000 lines of C code and 480,000 lines of proof. So this is a huge imbalance in the lines of code versus the lines of proof. It turns out SEL4 is an outlier. It requires way more proof than most of the other systems that we've talked about. One hypothesis for why that might be is that it's very hard to specify a microkernel. There's tons of interoperability, connections. Like this is the call graph of SEL4. It's not nicely modularized with little pieces over there, little pieces over there. It's all kind of a rat's nest. And this rat's nest, I think, contributes to why it is so much harder to prove it functionally correct than other kinds of things. It took about 13 person years to prove SEL4 was correct, plus another 8 person years building up infrastructure that is arguably reusable, so somewhere between 13 and 21 person years. It is now the fastest known microkernel in terms of the one-way IPC fastpath, which is the performance measure of metric of merit for this particular kind of thing. They're very proud of that. And they have a ton of machine check theorems about the system, including access control enforcement, non-interference, the fact that they proved it about the C code, but they've separately proven if you compile that C code down to assembly, the same property, the way they compile that C code down to assembly, the same property holds of the assembly that held over the C. And they proved separately that the IPC fastpath was functionally correct, and it's all now available open source. So this is like an exquisite artifact that is a tremendous resource to the entire world in terms of giving a tool in the toolkit to make systems that are dramatically more secure. This is like one of the key things that made that helicopter test possible. The other example that I use is the verifying compiler, CompCert Verifying C Compiler. So it's a large subset of C. It's not all of C. For example, it doesn't have concurrency, but it is the subset of C that's used by the aviation industry. It was implemented and proven correct in Coq by Xavier Leroy. It's about 42,000 lines of code plus proof. So you can see that the size here is much, much lower in proof effort than the size for the SEL4 microkernel. It was only 3 person years to build, but of course this is Xavier person years, so that's like, double it or triple it for normal person years, but still also significantly less than the 21 or 8 or 13 person years for SEL4. In terms of speed, it's about twice as fast as GCC with no optimization, and it's somewhere between 7 and 12% slower with level 1 and level 2 optimization. And they're working on having it become the compiler for Airbus software. Right now, aviation software to get it certified, you have teams of experts who read the assembly language. They don't trust the compiler. Getting a tool certified for use in aviation, particularly a tool that generates code, is well nigh, it's like super, super hard. So even though they have a proof of correctness, they're not sure that it's good enough. So they're still in a certification process for CompCert. It's, mind-boggling. Okay, so then what are the impediments to using formal methods? Certainly there are plenty. They're still very important. So the point that you brought up, Franz, how many people are there who actually can do this? So this is a chart from 2009, so it's 10 years old, but it basically shows that I guess it was published in 2009 and it was reporting on a survey that was done in 2006. There were less than 5,000 formal methods experts on the whole planet. So that's definitely higher now because many universities have started teaching formal methods, but it's still a number that's in the thousands, maybe 50,000 if we're being optimistic. It's not in anywhere near the number of Java programmers, so it's still a rare skill. Another impediment is the required level of effort, right? There can be significant overhead. If you have to both write the code and prove it's correct, that and means that there's more work that you have to do than you had to do before. And there can be significant overhead, as we saw with SEL4. So this chart collects a whole bunch of different examples that have been published in the last 10 years on formally proving something and talking about how much effort was taken in order to be able to produce the code. There are some signs for optimism, like this one, the P256 elliptic crypto algorithm that's going to be published in Security and Privacy this year. That's a crypto algorithm that gets written by hand on every new platform, every new machine by world experts, of whom there are no more than there are formal methods experts. And here, Adam Chapala and his team at MIT were able to generate the code that was just as fast as the handwritten C, and therefore generated it much faster than the handwritten code, because they can take the parameters and generate it for that machine with those parameters very, very quickly. So there is overhead, but it's getting better, and it's not always super high. And if you think about the price of the insecurities, maybe this overhead is well worth it. We can talk about misaligned incentives if you'd like in a little while. Okay, so time to deliver the software is one problem. Another problem is the performance consequences. It's often the case that the formally verified software is actually slower than the non-formally verified software. Like, my watch is really annoying. Why would I want to see the weather right now? Like, just the time, please. Right, so the formally verified software often is a little bit slower, and that usually it's usually because code that has been super optimized has special cases, and every single special case is a whole another proof that has to be done. And so generally when you're proving code, you prove it until you get something that's fast enough, and then you stop. And so that fast enough might be slower than what you could do if you didn't have to do the proof. But as I've been giving this talk, the speed of the formally verified systems has been creeping up on the speed of the non-verified systems. So for example, SEL4 is now the fastest IPC path. CompCert hasn't changed. The HMAC and the random bit generation and the TLS handshake that is used in Amazon's S2N service is now the one that is formally verified. So it may not be as fast as the one that wasn't formally verified, but Amazon replaced it anyway. Amazon decided that the formally verified version was fast enough that it was better to use it than the slightly, potentially slower one. Similarly with this crypto algorithm, right? And so generally a little bit slower, but it doesn't have to be that way. Then keeping up, right? So one really important thing in writing code is if your static analysis or if your software engineering tool is fast enough to be used in the developer tool chain, so that when the developer checks in code, they have to wait until you get the formal method or whatever, the tool check back, then you're much more likely to get the results of that analysis into the actual code base. So Facebook bought a company called Infer that is doing static analysis of the code in apps for Facebook every single time you check it in. So it can run its analysis over the entire Android and iOS code base within 4 hours. But that's not the statistic that really matters. The one that really matters is that for a single diff that the developer checks in, it can run it in less than 10 minutes. So that's fast enough that it can be part of the normal check-in process, that the check-in can't finish until this check is happy. So that's the upside. The downside is it's only proving the absence of null pointer errors and resource leaks. So in terms of formal verification, it's kind of on the low end of the guarantee spectrum, but at massive, massive scale. Also integrated into the tool chain is what Amazon Web Services is using for that HMAC, DRGB, and TLS handshake piece. They have the proof going from the high-level specification of what HMAC is supposed to be doing all the way down to the actual code that implements that's running on the machine. And the high-level specification, the high-level algorithm for HMAC changes almost never. Like it's changed once in more than 20 years. But the code that's doing the implementation actually changes pretty often, and they want that end-to-end proof to go all the time. So they built a system where if you make such a change, it can re-verify that the proof still holds, again, in less than 10 minutes, so fast enough to fit in the tool chain. And in 12 months, they replayed the correctness proof 956 times, so this change happens all the time, but only 3 times did the automatic rewrite fail. Only 3 times did a person have to come and fix something to change the proof. Because the low-level details that are changing often are usually not actually changing the fundamental reason why the proof is going through. So keeping up, then we talked about the fine print, right? All these formal methods tools have assumptions, and if you violate those assumptions, all bets are off. So John Rager is a researcher at Utah, and he uses testing to evaluate compilers. In 2012, he had published a paper that found 325 bugs in various C compilers, including 2 in CompCert. And the CompCert bugs were in the unverified front end, so the parser, and the hardware model. So those were things that were not in the fine print, right? Those were both in the assumptions. The proof of correctness assumed that the compiler was correct and assumed that the actual hardware conformed to the model of the hardware that was used in the proof. So John Rager wrote in the paper that the striking thing about the CompCert results is that the middle-end bugs that they found in all the other compilers were absent. CompCert is the only C compiler they've tested for which CSmith cannot find wrong code errors, so things in the middle. And it wasn't for lack of trying. They had dedicated 6 CPU years to trying to find bugs, and they did not find any. Okay, so those are impediments. So taking stock, where do we stand? So lessons learned. So one of the lessons learned is don't start verification until you're pretty sure you've eliminated all the low-hanging bugs. Also, verify the code while you're writing it at the same time. Don't take an artifact that's already been written and then try to verify it post facto. The reason is that if you're writing the code, you can, for one, if you're writing it, you know what all the invariants are. You don't have to go spelunking through documentation and try to page back in what people knew in the past. You know it in your head because you're writing the code. But also, there's often the case where you have choices. You could do something in way A or way B, and maybe you don't really care between, they both seem equally good to you. But if you're trying to prove it, it could be way A is really easy to prove, and way B is really pain to prove. So if you're responsible for proving it, you'll do the way A in the first place. Another really important lesson is don't verify all the code. Like we saw with the Boeing helicopter, that the researchers could verify pieces of it, but they could leave entire parts of it unverified and not affect the overall operation of the helicopter. So if you architect your system carefully, you can use these exquisite artifacts like SEL4 and verified crypto to build a system that is much more secure, even though not every single part of the system is super secure. Then there are tons and tons and tons of ongoing research and challenges. So one of them is, if we're going to talk about real systems, we have to have formal models of real systems, and that's a huge project. A lot of the work that Peter Sewell is doing on building very detailed models of actual systems is helpful here. We need to be able to increase automation, things like the SAT solver, but on steroids, much more elaborate automation systems. Figuring out how to maintain those really big proofs. Right? We have a whole field of study of software engineering for how to maintain software. We have very little expertise with maintaining proofs. This one is also really important, getting buy-in and adoption. I talked about the Amazon Web Services where they started using formal methods techniques to find 1 in a million events. There was one evangelist at the company who read a formal methods paper and was really excited about it. He was, on the flip side, really worried about the possibility of things slipping through the cracks. So he went and talked to his buddy, and the buddy agreed that this was really important, and they agreed they needed to go talk to the rest of their team and get the rest of the team on board. But as they were thinking about how to talk to the rest of the team about it, they decided that they really didn't want to call it formal methods. They thought if they called it formal methods, people would stop listening, they wouldn't pay any attention, and they wouldn't get any buy-in. So in the whole process, they didn't call it formal methods, they called it exhaustively testable pseudocode. And the developers were super excited. They're like, I've got to get me that exhaustible testable pseudocode, tell me how to do it, right? So there was a lot of buy-in. But that was because the people who were coming and talking to them were very careful about how they presented it and was really motivated why it could help them get their job done. And then kind of the two, well, there's actually two elephants in the room. One is the hardware issues, right? We're discovering that the model that hardware vendors have been providing to software does not match really well what's going on. And there's all sorts of places for hackers to exfiltrate information and do nefarious things by exploiting that mismatch. And the other is concurrency. Almost all of this formal methods work so far is focused on single-threaded code. Concurrency causes a state space explosion, which makes the space that you have to search way, way, way bigger. And the search space was already big enough. So that's the kind of two elephants in the room. So in terms of taking stock, I think we really are within reach of a place where we can get critical parts of critical systems written using formal methods-based techniques that have been proven to be functionally correct. And we can use those pieces to build much more complex systems that are much harder to hack into than we are now, so that at least we will get to a place where it's not implementation vulnerabilities that are the cause of the problems, but other vectors that are less scalable. So for example, here we have Black Hat, who is finding a rock that weighs as much as a person, so he can take it to a car and drop it into the front seat of the self-driving car and tell it to drive to Alaska, right? So it's still possible to hack this car, but now Black Hat has to actually pick up a rock and take it to the car. He can't wirelessly call into the car and cause it to drive away. And so like he can only lift so many rocks at a time, right? So it's much, much less scalable. And with that, I will stop and take questions. Yeah, Franz.
So you're just actually suggesting that the sensor that checks whether the seat is empty, that might be the weakest link. And it's probably not very fine.
Potentially. I mean, the point of the cartoon is more that I'm in no way saying that this will make it so security goes away, right? We saw the list of the gazillion things that the octopus was worried about. But if we can push the vulnerabilities and the mistakes into places where it's much harder to scale attacks, then we're overall in a much more secure place. Yes?
Are there programming languages or programming language features that make it easier to write software that can be verified?
Sure, yes. So functional code in general is much easier to verify than non-functional code. So, or very controlled use of side effects is much easier. Runtime systems are a pain in the neck, actually. So it's not surprising that most verified code is written in C and not Haskell, because Haskell you have to verify that whole runtime system too at the same time. Concurrency is much harder, so if you can avoid concurrency, good structured program, good modularity is super important. So basically the things that you expect in terms of writing code that is easier to understand, easier to refactor, are the same kinds of things that makes the code easier to verify.
Dependently typed languages?
Potentially, dependently typed languages fold information into the type system that is not in the type system in statically typed languages. But if you're going all the way to a theorem prover, you have way more power than just a dependent type system at your fingertips as well. More questions? Yes?
Curious, how many systems are there? I know a few, but like you mentioned sort of developing the proofs as you go with the program, right? Which sort of I envision that you might have like an extended type checker, right, where you're going to attach preconditions and postconditions and things. Are there systems that are sort of trying to target mass, right? By mass, I don't know what I mean, but it's not JavaScript, all JavaScript programmers, but it's more than formal methods researchers. Trying to be easy for proving simple stuff. So.
Yeah, so there's a whole spectrum. None of it is super easy yet. I think some of the lowest hanging fruits are things like Liquid Haskell, which adds forms of dependent type to the type system and then uses SAT solvers and SMT solvers to discharge as many of those obligations as possible. So you get to have richer properties about your functions than simple type properties. You can prove that something is going to return an even number, for example, instead of any number. So that's kind of at the easy end of the spectrum. Then you have things like ESC Java and C# that, like Rustin Leno has worked on a lot, that's kind of adding very rich specification languages with fancy solvers under the covers to discharge as much as possible. And then at the far end of the spectrum, you have things like you can write in Coq. There's a functional programming language inside of Coq. You have to prove all your functions terminate or admit them. But you can then extract the code that will actually run at the same time. And there are other interactive theorem provers that have a similar field to them. So kind of the spectrum from relatively easy to use, relatively weak properties that you can prove that way, through to harder to use, but you can prove anything that you're smart enough to prove about the system. There's a lot of research going into making these systems more accessible. There are lots of books being written and tutorials being written. So it's not going to be for the mass market JavaScript programmer for a really long time, maybe ever. But I think what I would say is that there's a lot of code that we don't care how assured it is, and that the tools are getting to the point where the serious system developers can actually use them to produce systems. And their companies are starting to have financial motivation to invest in producing quality software that's that high. So Microsoft has huge efforts in verification in software that I didn't particularly highlight here, but I'm sure Tom could fill us in. So we're moving slowly in a good direction, and if you take where we were 15 years ago and where we are now, I think nobody would have thought we would be here. I remember going to a conference with Tony Hoare talking about the compiler. The grand challenge for programming languages should be to produce a verified compiler, which Xavier did very shortly thereafter. So going from something that people thought was going to be a huge challenge and take forever to oh, nope, that was done. Now what are we going to do? So progress is possible, but it's not steady. Question, yeah?
I think you have a question about how you layer different formally verified systems on top of each other. So I think about the analogy to programming languages, right? Like FFI with boundaries can be super leaky and the source of a ton of different bugs. I was wondering whether in the formal verification world there's if I have one system with a bunch of guarantees and another system with a bunch of assumptions, whether there's a way to automatically align them, or if it's still this kind of FFI and leaky abstraction world.
Yeah, so it depends. I mean, you can use the FFI leaky abstraction if you want and just promise that the code does what you said it does, and then you get what you get. But it is possible to write detailed specifications of the interfaces and check that the specs match. There's there's a big NSF project going on right now called Deep Specification that has people from Penn and Princeton and MIT and a few other places working on it. That's really focused on exactly that question. How do you give a specification that is rich enough that everybody knows what they need to know, but is still such that you can really guarantee that the interface isn't leaking any information. And part of the importance of the functional correctness proof is not just saying that it will do this, but it also says it won't do anything else. That won't do anything else is really important, because as you say, a lot of the security vulnerabilities come about at the interfaces where each side can actually do way more than it's promising, and an attacker can exploit that way more. So locking down the interfaces and making it so that the system can only do what it's advertising is a really important part of security. Yes?
And it's also that the abstractions are actually correct, right? If you look at all these interesting Spectre and Meltdown and all these interesting side channel
Absolutely.
attacks, they are completely outside of the specs, but it's just
Read the
side
fine
channels
print.
are still a problem.
Absolutely. Well, right, and what I've been talking about is proving that an implementation satisfies its specification. But there's a whole nother, how do you know that specification is what you want, right? You need to really test the specification to make sure that what you wrote down as what you said you wanted really is what you wanted. So this isn't a magic wand, and it isn't even attempting to solve a vast part of the space. But I say it is solving an important part of the problem reasonably well at this point. I mean, it's showing the promise to solve this part of the problem, making it worth our while to start solving the other parts of the problem. I don't know how you solve the spear phishing with more and more accurate emails. I think AI systems are going to be to the place where they can craft spear phishing messages that will fool pretty much anybody relatively soon. So yeah, lots of problems still out there, but it's nice to make progress on some problems. Any last questions? Thank you very much for your time.